Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to our summer historical briefing, Archaeology of the Region. I'm Caitlin Whitaker, and I am the Associate Vice President for Membership and Development Services here at Selby Gardens. And I'm here to welcome you all and to introduce my colleague and friend, John McCarthy, who is our Vice President for Regional History. And he is going to be sharing some about the archaeology of the region today. If you all have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat. We will try to save some time for questions at the end. And I did see we already had a question come in about whether or not this will be available online in the future. And yes, it will on the Selby Gardens YouTube channel. That can take a little bit of time to get up there, but it will be up there in the next few weeks or so. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John McCarthy.
Thank you, Caitlin. I appreciate it. And thank you to Amanda behind the scenes running the Zoom. And a huge thank you to Jennifer Romanecki, our president and CEO, for inviting me to present a summer briefing series this year. And we started out with a program about Bertha Palmer's gardens at the historic Spanish Point campus. We then last month did a program on the Florida Highwaymen and how their art reflects aspects of old Florida that wasn't captured in any other way except with their art. And today I wanted to share information about archaeology of the region because this area that we live in is rich with Native American history. And so today, the program is going to talk a little bit about who were these people? Who were these Native Americans who lived here, who built the shell mounds, who lived here for thousands of years? And then to kind of explore all the different sites that are here in Sarasota, which span a tremendous length of time, going back 12,000 years before present. And then, just from a historical standpoint, I thought it would be fun to go back and capture how Sarasota has responded to archaeological discoveries over the years, going way back into the 1800s. As Caitlin said, if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat, and then Caitlin will share those questions with me at the end. So let's get started with the people who lived here. Perhaps the most common question is, who were these people that built the shell mounds? Who were these people that lived in Florida long ago? And, I remember learning this in school where, during the last ice ages, there were portions of the ice that was not ice. And so people could come from Siberia across through Beringia and across this Bering Strait into Alaska and what's now Canada and down into actually North America, Central America, and South America in a remarkably short period of time. And this is what we were all taught in school, is that this migration occurred during the Ice Age. Back years ago, it was thought that maybe people came to this country, several thousand years ago, probably not more than 10. And that has really changed because now we know that people were here 20,000 years ago and possibly even much earlier than that. The other thing that has really changed is the understanding that many people may have come from Siberia, that area of the world, and come across actually by water and were able to be much more efficient. I mean, if you think about how long it would take for you to travel, if you were deliberately walking over these thousands of mile distances versus what happens when you have a boat and you're able to navigate. And so now the prevailing thought is that both the land bridge and the sea route is how people migrated into North America and then ultimately again into Central and South America. So I think that's very helpful to think about because you can navigate much more quickly, and it begins to explain how various areas, especially all the way down to Argentina, were colonized so quickly after people came across the Bering Strait. And so the climate in Florida when people first came here was different. The animals were different. It was kind of the end of the Pleistocene, the end of the Ice Age, if you will. Mammoth, mastodons, saber cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, horses, camels, all sorts of amazing what's called Pleistocene megafauna were here. And more evidence points to the fact that humans were here before all these animals became extinct. And people at that point would have been hunting and gathering. They would have known, and they would have sought out freshwater springs because, of course, springs are essential for life. Freshwater is essential for life. And so this particular image shows Native Americans coexisting with the Pleistocene megafauna and surrounding a spring site, which then over time, as things changed, as the population grew, and as the coastal areas were more lived in, then diets changed from a lot of that protein coming from the large animals and instead protein coming from seafood. We know that the people that lived here were seafarers. They had their canoes and other boats that they could travel in and go to different areas. It is amazing to think about the super abundance of resources that were here for these people. Fish in abundance, of course, shellfish in abundance, game in the woods in abundance, and edible plants and useful plants in abundance all over what we now call Florida. And I think this image by Merrill Clark is just such a great depiction of that bounty of nature that provided the Native Americans here in this part of Florida sustenance for thousands of years. For thousands of years, they harvested seafood from the bay, apparently with no impact, and were able to live sustainably here along the shores of Sarasota and Little Sarasota and the other bays in the area. I think this depiction is great because it kind of begins to show us a little bit what Spanish Point would look like without all the vegetation. And so Spanish Point has a couple of different archaeological features that we'll talk about more in the program. But this really shows kind of what the point itself looks like. It has a flat top, it has the steeply sloped sides, and it's all built up very deliberately out of shell to elevate residences above high tides, storm tides, better view, better breeze, fewer bugs, lots of reasons for going up. But I think this is a great representation of these shell mounds, not just as accidental depositories for the shellfish that were consumed, but a deliberate architecture, putting a strong foundation underneath your village huts so that you could prevail in high tides and storms and things like that. The people that lived here were exceptionally creative. We see this in their art. We see it in the pottery that they decorated so carefully. We see it in how they crafted shell and bone and even fossils into tools and ornaments and jewelry and everything that they needed for their culture and their lives. And we know from the contact that occurred in the contact period of the 1500s that they wore a lot of tattoos. And so you see in these renderings tattooed individuals who are working their clay and creating vessels that they would use to store food, prepare food as an essential part of their life. And by the way, at the historic Spanish Point campus back in the early 1960s, when archaeologists were taking a very detailed look at what was there, when the pottery was looked at, it was found to be some of the oldest pottery that had ever been found in the Americas at that time. Now, since that time, older pottery has been found in other areas, but this was really groundbreaking for this region. Fiber-tempered pottery, where palmetto fibers were mixed with sand and clay to form a different type of pottery, somewhat innovative and one of the earliest forms of pottery known. And they created items out of wood, most of which have perished because, of course, wooden items, being quite organic, have a tendency to rot or break down, and they're only preserved if perhaps within a peat layer, a mangrove muck, and other conditions which render anaerobic situation where there's no oxygen, so there's no bacteria, so therefore there isn't the deterioration. And this is an example of an artist creating a mask. Kind of reminded me of our Costa Rican masks that we see each year at Selby Gardens. And so they made dyes out of the berries and plants that were available to them so that they could paint these masks. And we only know about these wooden artifacts largely from some expeditions that were done at Marco Island back in the 1890s, where a gentleman named Cushing conducted research and actually went down into the mangrove muck and there found this wonderfully sculpted deer's head, the eagle's head, the alligator head, and all of these wood sculptures really show craftsmanship and artistic design taste and are just great representations of the world around these people. And this is perhaps the most famous piece of Florida Native American art. This is believed to be a panther. This is carved from lignum vitae or ironwood that grows down in the Keys and in the Caribbean. And this is housed in the Smithsonian Institution and has actually now been put on loan to a museum in Marco Island where it can be seen back closer to its natural habitat. I remember going to the Smithsonian when I was about 12 years old, and this was what I wanted to see was the Florida cat. A lot of people are curious about what connection the Seminole tribe has to the Native Americans that built the shell mounds. And because it's important to realize that there were Native Americans living in the area 12,000 years ago, and there are Native Americans still living here today. And the Seminole tribe and the Miccosukee tribe are quite active in Florida, both in preserving history and sharing it. And just earlier this year in January, in their own newspaper, they announced a linkage actually between the early mound builders along the coast and how some of those people had merged with the Seminole tribe. Most of the Seminoles had come from Georgia and Alabama and had herded cattle in the northern and central parts of Florida since the 1700s, and then were pushed further and further south by development and the federal government and ending up, down in Big Cypress and the Everglades. And that's what happened to apparently some of the mound builders as well, who then merged with what is now Seminole tribe. And so they say that the Bear Clan welcomed these other people into their society. And the Seminoles are alive and well. Among other things, they own Hard Rock Cafe and Casinos. They have their own historic preservation office. They are very desperately trying to return their loved ones' human remains back to the tribes themselves and to try to prevent people from digging up more human remains that are sacred to them, of course, because they're their family members. So you'll see the No More Stolen Ancestors logo, and that's all about not digging up burial mounds and then going to the effort to work with the museums to get human remains repatriated back to the tribes, which is managed through a federal program and the tribes themselves. If you ever have a chance to go down to the Autothaki Museum down in Big Cypress, it's a wonderful museum that the Seminole tribe has built to tell their story, and it really helps you to understand Florida, to understand their culture. So let's talk about the ancient world around us right here in the Sarasota region, because if you're interested in archaeology or if you're interested in history, there's no better place to be than Sarasota. So the yellow borders are basically Sarasota County as seen by Google Earth from the Gulf of Mexico. And all those little yellow arrows are significant archaeological sites that exist all over Sarasota. Most people used to think about the Native Americans just living along the coastline because that's where you see the very obvious shell mounds. But there were people living all over this county. There are archaeological sites in Myakka River State Park. There's archaeological sites in other portions of environmental land that the county has preserved over the years. And so we're very fortunate when you preserve environmental land, you almost always preserve archaeological sites and important historical sites. There are very important sites in Northport that we're going to talk about in a moment. There's one of the most unique archaeological sites in the world, actually submerged in the Gulf of Mexico. That's the little yellow arrow down here on the lower right-hand side. This is the Manasota Key offshore site. We'll talk about that. But I also wanted to point out the purple arrows. This one leads us to Mound Street, where our downtown Sarasota campus is located. And just north of the downtown Sarasota campus used to be a very large mound. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then the other purple arrow, 10 miles south, the historic Spanish Point campus. So Marie Selby Botanical Gardens is surrounded by this history, as all of us are. here in Sarasota. So let's take a little closer look. So let's go down to Northport and let's start as far back in time as we can go. Now, this is an aerial photograph of Little Salt Spring. This is a 12,000-year-old archaeological site. It is owned by the University of Miami, has a wonderful nature preserve that's part of that ownership. Marie Selby Botanical Gardens has a history botanically of working with University of Miami to document some unusual orchids that grow here along the slough that comes out of Little Salt Spring. So there's so many opportunities for botany and history to connect. It's really amazing. And then just to help you get your bearings, if you're familiar with Northport, up at the top, this is Price Boulevard. Lower left-hand corner is Glen Allen Elementary School. Up here at the top right, that's Heron Creek Middle School, and then Northport High School across the street there. This is a utility facility for Northport here in the middle. And then you see this weird driving range. That's a law enforcement training range. So Little Salt Spring has three different components. One is the spring itself. The other is a slough that runs north from lands to the north and runs toward the spring. And this is actually a burial area for the people that lived here, 10 to 12,000 years ago. And then also there are shell middens in this area as well, where people conveyed shellfish from the waterfront and brought it out and camped here. So let's take a closer look at Little Salt Spring. This is the cover of Science magazine back in 1979, the year I graduated from high school, featuring Little Salt Spring and the work that was going on there at the time. So you see the surface of the water, you see the woods that surround it, you see a dock going out to a platform, and then you see what's underwater. And what you have is a gently sloped up to a certain point, and then the sinkhole just falls out. These are all limestone layers. This is a karst limestone that is known to create these sinkholes and fissures in the ground. There are a number of them in Sarasota. And so this goes down a couple hundred feet to a debris cone. But the important thing is on these ledges that you see here, people lived 12,000 years ago. Sea level was lower, so the surface of the spring too was lower. And they actually used ropes to go from this point down to these ledges. And that's one of the things that's just so significant about Little Salt Spring in Sarasota. And so you can see the depths here, 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet, 200 feet before you get down to the sediment. You see what they call the Mastodon Ledge. So that's basically where sea level was maybe 20, 30,000 years ago. And then you see that what they call the Indian Ledge. This is where sea level was and where the spring water level was, approximately 12,000 years ago. So in order to conduct archaeology here, one must dive. Some of the amazing former belongings of the Native Americans, now we might call them artifacts. This is a piece of a deer antler. This was fashioned into a weight for a spear thrower, a throwing stick, which was used to get added leverage in throwing long spears. And you can see it has been notched or cut. And maybe this reflects how many times it's been used. Maybe this notching made the binding stick better. We don't know, but it is an undisputable item showing human interaction. And then perhaps University of Miami's perhaps most proud find there is this greenstone pendant, which represents trade with the Great Lakes area. So very unique discovery to be made in the area of 10 to 12,000 years old, that they had trade with people living thousands of miles away. And this is a beautiful artist rendering of what it must have been like at that time. And if you see, it's almost like a cave, but it's going down. You can see vines or ropes hanging down. Archaeologists actually found wooden pins put into the side of the wall that they hypothesized were used with vines to be able to go up and down. There was a National Geographic article years ago about the discovery of a giant land tortoise there that had been butchered and cooked right there on the ledge. And this was kind of when all the news broke about the significance of Little Salt Spring. So 12,000 years before the present day. And so here we are again with an aerial view of Northport up at the top, Little Salt. And then as we move down here, Warm Mineral Springs. Now, Warm Mineral Springs is probably more well known. It was a place where back in the early part of the 20th century, people would go and camp there and hunt there. And then in the 1950s, it was developed as a spa. So this is what it looks like today. The spring itself has been modified a little bit. It used to be a little more circular. The shape has changed a little bit. This is the entrance to the spa. This is the cyclorama. There's been some discussion recently about the preservation of these buildings by the city of Northport. But the archaeological materials are way down in the spring, just like a Little Salt. For most people, it's a health spa. But for archaeologists, it's a very unique situation, very similar to Little Salt, discovered prior to Little Salt Spring, by the way, in terms of the archaeological remains. And here again, you've got a debris cone at the bottom where virtually everything that ever fell into the spring is still there, whether it's an old rusty license plate or 10,000-year-old pollen. So there's a tremendous amount of history there. And again, you have these ledges where people lived and where people died, and have been preserved by the anaerobic nature of the water. So for instance, when work was being done at Warm Mineral Springs in the early days, one of the sets of human remains that came up actually had material in the brain case of the skull, and it turned out to be preserved brain material. It was actually studied by Sarasota Memorial Hospital pathologist Dr. Hendry, who confirmed that it was brain material, and then it was confirmed that it was approximately 9,000 years old. Now, we talk about this sea level change, and this was all because of the end of the Ice Age, essentially. And Florida, with its very shallow offshore waters on the west coast of Florida, you can imagine if all of the waters caught up in those glaciers, then the water level is much lower. And over here on the Gulf of Mexico side, you can see there's almost as much of Florida that was here then that's gone now. It's like half of Florida is gone now. Over on the East Coast, lower East Coast, not as dramatic because the geology really drops off there into the Gulf Stream and the Atlantic Ocean. But even in the northern portions of Florida, you see a broad area here. And so 12,000 years ago, people were living out here. And this wasn't underwater where we fish, boat, swim, and dive. This was like fine flatwoods, like you find, out in Mayaca Park now. And to kind of bring that to bear, back in, I think, 2016, 2017, the state of Florida started working a site called the Minnesota Key Offshore Site, which is a ceremonial burial site that apparently was used from 8,000 to 7,000 years ago, and was actually a wetland, a freshwater wetland pond in a pine flatwood situation that is now under 33 feet of water in the Gulf of Mexico offshore Minnesota Key down near Inglewood. This, by the way, is Melissa Price. She's one of the primary divers for the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research, and she's been a part of this project at Minnesota Key Offshore from the very beginning. You also have lined up here people from Florida Public Archaeology Network, Seminole Tribe of Florida, Florida Aquarium, who provided dive safety assistance. So this was a very collaborative effort to document this particular site that came about because of somebody was shark's tooth hunting and then reported seeing other things to the state of Florida. So very significant. And again, this is what everything looked like out there, what is now the Gulf of Mexico. It was just more of what Florida looks like out east. And so these people at this time had a custom of burying their loved ones on the edge of these freshwater ponds. And so as we talk about that Minnesota Key offshore site, this is basically the green shows you an old ancient freshwater pond with the bottom being filled with peat muck. That peat muck is just as anaerobic or lacking in oxygen as the water down in Little Salt and Warm Mineral Springs. So there's been an amazing protection of the remains that were placed in this pond. But could you imagine this burial cemetery kind of survived? It survived sea level rise. It survived all kind of sand moving in on top of it. And so the anaerobic aspect of the peat saved it kind of to begin with, then sand covered it all up, and then more recent storm events and erosion have kind of revealed it. But to look here, all of the brown dots represent wooden artifacts that have been found. Again, very unique for wooden artifacts to survive 7,000 to 8,000 years. And then also all of the green dots represent human remains who were very carefully interred by their loved ones in a very special way along the edge of this pond and preserved all these years. So here's some of the work taking place underwater. This was mostly a salvage operation. Unfortunately, there had been vandals to the site. And so the state went in to try to clean it up, document what they could, get some dating done. There's been very limited work done on the site in the last couple of years because really there's no need to dig up the site. The Seminole tribe would rather it be preserved and just let it go its way and not feel like you've got to dig all of it up. I did want to show this rendering because when we think about archaeological sites, and over time as people settled more along the shoreline, as the glaciers melted and sea level came up and shoreline stabilized about 5,000 years ago, they really shifted their protein source to the seafood. And then having the hard shellfish, the calcium shellfish remaining, they began to use that for construction and in a very deliberate way. And in fact, at Spanish Point, which we'll talk about later, there's two features that are significant. The shell ridge going out perpendicular out into the bay, which is very unusual. And then also the shell ring that the Guptill House sits upon and the fern garden is there. And I wanted to show this because this kind of shows what that shell ring looks like. You can't see it this way at Spanish Point because of all the vegetation. But basically, the left-hand side here, this shell ring, and there's only about 5 of these in the state of Florida. This is very similar to what is at Spanish Point. If you could picture the shoreline over here, the Guptill House here, and this exit is down by the aqueduct, this is basically what it would look like. And this is believed to be a ceremonial construct with a plaza in the middle. It was originally thought to be built around a freshwater spring. And then looking at Spanish Point, again, these very unique features that we have here, starting, maybe 5,000 or more years ago with the shell ring here. So when you're at the Guptill House at the historic Spanish Point campus, you're approximately 20 feet above sea level on a shell mound. The construction started about 5,000 years ago and wrapped up about 3,000 years ago. And this is believed to be a seasonal gathering spot. It is believed to be more ceremonial than residential. But there's probably a lot more to be learned and a lot of secrets that will be kept by the mound itself. But this is very unique to have a feature like this preserved. And then the shell ridge, which is started construction about 2,500 years ago, extending straight out into the bay, due west. And very unique in that most shell mounds in Florida are parallel to a watercourse. And in this case, it is very perpendicular. Now, there's a thought that the deep water channel that we enjoy today for our boat tours might have been part of an ancient stream. And that so in that regard, this ridge could very well be parallel to that waterway, but it still makes it very unique. And of course, once you go by the gazebo and you kind of get by the crossroads and enter the woods, you're on Shell Mound. And it's just a fascinating preserved area. These are some sketches from the report that was done by Ripley and Adelaide Bullen back in the early 1960s at the request of Gordon Palmer, who was Bertha's grandson. And so they kind of delineated, here's what they call the hill midden, because they called the Guptill House the Hill Cottage. That's what Bertha called it. And then you have the Shell Ridge. And Ripley and Adelaide thought that the Chapel Ridge was actually separate. But it now appears that this was actually connected more, and it was actually the Webb family that had cut a little trench through it and bisected it here. And then you see the burial mound, which is made of sand. So all the chapel mound where the cemetery is and Mary's Chapel, all the way out to the end of the ridge, that's all man-made. And again, starting approximately 2,500 years ago and wrapping up about 800 years ago. And then this is a more close-up view of the shell ring, the archaic shell ring, with the Guptill House here, Fern Walk down here. And you can see how this is like a horseshoe shaped with the water from the spring exiting to the north, requiring Bertha Palmer to build the aqueduct in her garden to cross that water that exited from the original spring site in the center of the archaic shell ring. And then these are some artistic renderings that were done of Spanish Point years ago, kind of showing it when it was more of just a sandbar before the mound had been constructed up so high. And I think it's neat to kind of look at that. And again, kind of see the lifestyle. The people, we know they lived in round houses because we can see the post holes in the shell. And they would have used all the resources available to them, like the cabbage palm trees for the thatch. They did a lot of smoking of meat to preserve the meat and the fish. And you see dogs in this rendering because actually dogs had been domesticated by this point, and there's evidence of 4 dogs having been buried in the burial mound at Spanish Point. So it's important to talk about that. And of course, the constant building of the mound, the deliberate action to take this waste product from our meal and turn it into construction material so that we can have our houses above the high tides, above the storm tides, better view, more breeze, fewer bugs, all those advantages of going up. And the other thing I wanted to point out is that a lot of people ask, did they practice agriculture? And at this point in time, there's no evidence that they practiced agriculture, but I can assure you they were excellent botanists. In fact, Native American tribes had long relationships with plants, and they know what plants are good to eat and what plants not to eat and what plant heals this and what plant cures that. And so there's a tremendous encyclopedic knowledge of plants that resides within the Native American community. And so if you could imagine a place like Spanish Point where there's tremendous diversity of plant life, part of that was an advantage to the Native Americans, and part of it only exists because they built the shell mounds, because the shell mounds actually support certain types of plants that don't really exist anywhere else. So they created habitat, but they also took advantage of all the berries and the root type plants and other things that they could eat to enhance their diet of seafood. So just through a few of these issues. So I thought it would be good. I'll share with you a little timeline. And down at the bottom where it all begins, Little Salt Spring, 12,000 years before present. I like to use the BP designation before present because I don't like people to have to do the math and say, well, okay, you said BC and now I got to add 2,025 years. So I like to keep it simple and just say it was 12,000 years ago. We know that people were living at Little Salt Spring. 10,000 years ago, we know people were living at War Middle Spring. And then there's been the discovery of the Little Salt Spring Slough Cemetery, which was dated at 6,000 years before present. So that began to bring us a little bit more up in time. And then you have like a 5,000-year-old site like the archaic shell ring at the historic Spanish Point campus. And that's one of the oldest shell mounds in the region for sure. And then by 3,000 years ago, you've got shell mounds being constructed all over. And one of the most prominent ones that has survived is the Indian Mound Park site down in Inglewood, which has been preserved and you can go and visit. And then 2,500 years ago, again, the Shell Ridge at historic Spanish Point. So 2 separate eras of activity at Spanish Point, one in the archaic and one up in the more modern era of 2,500 years ago. And then shell middens and around all over. So I'm using this term mounds to describe the archaic shell ring, the Shell Ridge, but some of these areas were not prominent. In other words, it might have been a campsite area where people just camped and discarded material and wasn't part of a purposeful construction the way the mounds are at places like historic Spanish Point or Pine Land down on Pine Island in Lee County and some of these other sites. And so you do have a lot of shell middens around. I don't like to use the term midden anymore to describe the mounds at Spanish Point because it doesn't give it the full credit for what they were trying to do down there. And then just to kind of put things in perspective, 511 years ago, Ponce de Leon arrived at Charlotte Harbor, and that began a decline of the Native American population, mostly through disease, but also through becoming enslaved and also just being pushed off the land by colonizers. And so, of course, this is kind of the time period of all of this Native American activity in Sarasota. And there are older sites in Florida. There are sites that have been documented as old as 14,500 years ago in Florida. When Little Salt Spring was first documented in 12,000 years, that was the oldest discovery. But subsequently, they've pushed it back, and I expect they'll push it back even further as time goes on. Now, over on the right-hand side, I have some scientific words that the archaeologists and anthropologists use to describe these different time periods. And so you start with Paleo Man. He was using stone tools to hunt large game to feed the family. Then you get into the Archaic period where there's still hunting, but there's also the seafood and the fishing and shifting more out to the coastal areas. And the Archaic period is a very long period of time. So it's divided up into early, middle, and late. And then in this region, you have what was called the Minnesota culture. And that name was actually coined by Marion Almy and George Lure, two local archaeologists who began to see similarities in all of the sites within Sarasota and Manatee County that represented a certain time period. And they saw the same type of pottery and the same type of shell tools and the same type of jewelry. So they created this construct of the Minnesota culture to describe that period. And then the most recent period is called Safety Harbor. And that's approaching the time of Spanish discovery and Spanish arrival. And it represented a time where there was more leisure time. The pottery was much more decorated. There was more elaborate art and things like that. And it's called Safety Harbor period simply because the first place where that type of material was found was up in the Safety Harbor area. That's how a lot of these things get their names. Oh, and then over on the left-hand side, I always think it's interesting to put this in perspective that the archaic shell ring at historic Spanish Point is as old as the Great Pyramids at Giza, possibly older. That the Minnesota Key offshore site that where people were loved ones were being interred 8,000 years ago is as old as the walls of Jericho. And the Shell Ridge at Spanish Point, where the White Cottage and the cafe and everything else, the Bertha Palmer Sunken Garden, is as old as the earliest parts of the Great Wall of China. So, when we look at this globally, we're very significant here. So I'm captivated by how modern people have discovered and approached and studied the Native American culture. And believe it or not, the first real effort to understand this that took place in this region was John Webb, who had homesteaded what's now the historic Spanish Point campus. And so as he's digging his garden, he's finding these archaeological things. He knows about the shells. He understands how they got there. In fact, this is a little item from one of the Smithsonian Institute publications, and it describes in his own words. He said, "I discovered in ditching in my hammock a perfect skull. It was unfortunately broken in digging it out. But I shall send all the pieces, and you will find no difficulty in gluing it into perfect shape. It was intentionally buried." And then he goes all the way. He says, "I live on a shell mound adjoining the hammock." And so he had a friend in New York, and then this is fascinating too. This is a description by the Smithsonian of the Shell Ridge. For about 1/3 of a mile on the southern shore, is this well-preserved artificial shell mound. And he talks about the elevation of it, 15 to 16 feet, the breadth of it, about 125 feet. The main house sits right in the middle of it. That's White Cottage and the cafe. And he talks about it being platform-like, truncated at the top. So this is in the 1870s, folks, when John Webb finds this stuff. He has a friend in New York who knows Joseph Henry, who's the first director of the Smithsonian Institute. Joseph Henry has other scientists come down here, and they start taking a look at things. And this is one of the products from that, a map that was drawn of Osprey, showing the Shell Ridge and showing some of the discoveries that have been made in the 1870s. Now, in the 1890s, a gentleman comes down from Connecticut, Dr. Frederick K. Williams. He's from Bristol, Connecticut. He's an amateur archaeologist, and he discovers along the north shore of Sarasota, north of downtown, all these shell mounds and middens. And so he buys this land up, and he decides to plat it as a real estate development, and he's going to sell land to all of his friends up in Connecticut. They're going to come down and live at Indian Beach. So that's how we got the name Indian Beach, for that Indian Beach Sapphire Shores neighborhood, kind of north of Martin Luther King Boulevard, running all the way up toward the Brilliant Museum. But you'll see the brochure that he had from like the turn of the century, 1900, Indian Beach, Sarasota, Manatee County, Florida. And there are many archaeological remains still remaining in Indian Beach, because a lot of the houses there were built in the 1890s and in the early part of the 20th century, and they didn't really impact the mound that much. And so there are wonderful features there that are in people's front yards, backyards, side yards. There's a lot of history left up in the Indian Beach area. And some of you that have been following these Zooms might recall one that our great volunteer David Turner did, all about the history of the property here at Selby Gardens. In fact, he took the presentation and made it into a little book that you can buy called The Land of Selby. And this was the Zach Ruski subdivision. The gentleman platted this land he owned on both sides of Hudson Bayou. And this is how Mound Street got its name, because if you look close over here on the left-hand side, and don't squeeze your eyes too much, I'm going to show you a close-up view here. But he actually shows on the plat Indian Mound, 100 feet at the base, 20 feet high. And then he names this Mound Street. And by the way, a 60-foot right-of-way, which at the time, the only other street in Sarasota that was 60 feet was Main Street, but he platted both Mound and Palm Avenue as 60-foot right-of-ways. I put the green lines in there to kind of show you the current boundaries of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, downtown Sarasota campus. And so you can see, anybody asks, why is our address Mound Street? It's because there used to be a very magnificent mound just north of us. Now, this is not that mound, but this is a mound that fits the same description, about 100 feet around, about 20 feet tall. This particular mound was up in St. Petersburg, where the Bay Pines Veterans Hospital is today. But this is what that mound looked like to Zach Ruski when he platted that subdivision. No wonder he would have put it on the plat. And this is the first article in the Sarasota Times newspaper that describes an archaeological discovery. A gentleman named Joseph S. Moss, who was a contractor here, was doing work to widen Main Street back in 1910, and they came across human remains. They came across pottery and beads. And so this article ended up in the newspaper. It was quite a scene downtown as people gathered around to see what there was underground. So where was this? Well, this was right at 5 Points. And so it was right in front of the Sarasota House boarding house, which you see here. And the widening achieved what you see here with the concrete curbs and the packed soil Main Street. These photographs, this is like 1909. The one below is 1910. And then this is 5 Points there at Lower Main and Main Street. This is a very high location. That's why this is called Lower Main Street, right? Because it goes all downhill from there. So this would have been a great place to live if you were a Native American. You're close to the bay. Anyway, and we know that there are other shell middens here along the waterfront, most of which have been displaced by the residential development that has taken place in the last 30 years. Back to Indian Beach, this is the Palms Hotel. This was built as a little resort back in the 1890s. And this article to me is funny because it describes some of the vegetation, the nice gardens, but then it says that there's an Indian mound is but a short distance from the house. Well, indeed, there were some large mounds a short distance from the lodge, but the bottom line is this whole lodge is sitting on an Indian mound. If you look at it, it's all up on Indian mound. And this was located just south of what is now Martin Luther King Boulevard on the bayfront. And so there's another article about it, and this is years later. It's changed hands, and they're talking about how it's been left undisturbed, and the Indian mound that was so popular years ago is still there for people to come and visit. So these were always attractions to people in Sarasota. This is a postcard view that you might have seen before in the program I did on the gardens of Sarasota. This is Laura Honore's house. She was Bertha Palmer's aunt. She is actually who helped Bertha acquire her first piece of property at what's now the Spanish Point campus. But she bought land at approximately 13th Street and the Tamiami Trail north of Sarasota, built a home called the Acacias, and built this pergola on top of the sand mound that was there. And if you look close at the sign, it says Lookout Mountain. But again, instead of taking the sand from the mound and using it to build trails and roads, Laura Honore used it as a feature in her garden, preserved it, built on top of it. And this mound existed up through the 1950s. And then moving further south, but also the Palmer family. This is the home of Honore Palmer at what's now the Landing subdivision down getting toward Philippi Creek. And you don't see it in this particular photograph, but if the photographer had pivoted 180 degrees and taken a photograph in the other direction, there's an extensive set of shell mounds there along the shoreline in the landings. And Raymar Development back in the 1980s. Robert Morris was the principal of that development company. He developed a very innovative way to build foundations on top of the mound where he didn't penetrate the mound, but they just put these little pads all over the mound, and then they built the tree houses on top of them. So if you live in the tree houses, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not familiar with that, the Landings is a private development, so you can't go in and see it. But basically, this was a very innovative way to save the shell mounds, but also develop it. And it's interesting that the people that are living in those houses now are living right where the Native Americans lived, looking out at the same views and enjoying part of that same lifestyle. And then this image, also I've used before in the program on garden. This is basically at the Guptill Mound during Bertha Palmer's time. And the most special thing is how John Webb, the original homesteader, recognized and preserved the mound. And then Bertha Palmer came in at a time when most mounds were being consumed for road building fill because automobiles were all the rage, but instead she built her gardens upon the mounds. So if you go there today, this oak tree is still there. A lot of the other vegetation is still there. It is amazing over time. But these are photographs that kind of show loud and clear. This is what happened to most of the shell mounds in Florida. They were converted into roads, hauled away by the cartload. And here's another image that shows the same thing. Just go down to the mound and dig it up and throw it in your cart and go build a trail. Here's one even closer to home. This is a mound up at Whitaker Bayou. And it's a postcard view. It says, road cut through Indian Mounds, Sarasota, Florida. So to also emphasize this road building thing, here's an article from 1916. This is 7 years after the first car arrived in Sarasota. By now, there's like 100 cars in Sarasota. And it's talking about the road going up, how you got north from here. You basically went up, you crossed Whitaker Bayou, and then you went over toward the bay and around the Indian, and on the Indian Mounds, basically, was how the road worked up there in the Indian Beach area. And then this is an article written by an unhappy gentleman in Hillsborough County who was demanding that they build this Bayshore Road. This would have become really Hillsborough County's first part of the original Tamiami Trail. But this person thought they were dragging their feet because the county had purchased a huge shell mound up at Big Bend area, and they weren't tapping into it. And so, you know, this guy saying, hey, 8 years ago, you purchased a shell mound for $3,750. You got to go get that shell. So this is basically what was happening, except for people like the Palmers or the McClellan sisters who developed McClellan Park. Because actually McClellan Park was built around an Indian mound. Unfortunately, it's no longer there, but it was there. They built their roads around it instead of building it through it and instead of using it to build roads. And so 1916, McClellan Park was the first subdivision in Sarasota created and actually designed by landscape architect. It was the first subdivision created by women. Really interesting place. And all the articles in the paper about McClellan Park, they talk about the clubhouse, they talk about the tennis courts, they all talked about the ancient Indian mound. And in fact, the mound inspired the names of the streets because the McClellan sisters selected names that they thought were reflective of Native American names. And you see here, you see some of these early articles, interesting development of property near Sarasota. But again, very big focus on the Native American culture. And for those of you that play tennis, I thought I'd just throw this photo in of the tennis playing at McClellan Park in 1916. And then this is one of the first articles about someone vandalizing an archaeological site. Now, in the eyes of modern day people, a lot of the archaeologists might have been considered vandals because they were just going in and digging stuff up. And I'll give you some examples of that in a minute or two here. But this was actually vandalism of the mound right over here on Mound Street. And I was fascinated by this letter to the editor that some misguided person ignorantly and foolishly destroyed valuable evidence of scientific research, you know, makes one wonder if the age of barbarism is relegated to the long ago or the faraway corners of the earth. Desecrating places and bones of the dead for morbid curiosity is a type of vandalism that only savages resort to. And what's fascinating to me is that for years, archaeologists dug up human remains. It has only been in the last couple of years that there has not been that much of that, and largely due to Native Americans' objection to it and in the laws that have been in place so that Native American graves are not impacted. Now, another site that many people are familiar with in Sarasota is the Indianola site, better known as the Ide Center. And the IDE Center is a Center for Asian Language and Research here in Sarasota, down by Sarasota Square Mall. And back in the day, there actually was one of our first tourist attractions there in 1910. They had an alligator farm. People would come and see the alligators. But here it's being developed as a subdivision, and they're very much focused on the shell walks, the citrus trees, and the famous Indian shell mound. So this is the plat for Indianola. And here is a very unique feature, which is believed to be a fish holding pond. In other words, they could catch fish out in the bay. Shell mound surrounds this entire little pond. And it's believed that they could bring a bunch of fish in, put it in this pond, and then it was like their freezer. They had fish right there. They didn't have to go out and catch it. There's a pond almost identical to this at the landings years ago. It's filled in quite a bit. It's kind of become a marsh now. But at any rate, this is Indianola. And then out at the corner of Bee Ridge Road and where Swift and Tuttle come together, the Brookside development, as they were developing that, they found Indian mounds. And so you see the headlines here, Mammoth Indian Burial Mound is uncovered. It was the burials that always got people's attention, but there's so many other aspects of it than just the burials. But here are their advertisements in the newspaper. Have you been to see our Indian mound? Indian mound is unearthed. Experts want to view the mound and all this stuff. Now, then this guy comes to town in 1920. His name is J.E. Moore. And J.E. Moore is an amateur archaeologist, but he's also a paleontologist. He's very interested in fossils, and maybe that's what brought him here in the first place, because there's a lot of fossils here too. At any rate, he put out a plea in the 1920s to say, hey, all these mounds have been destroyed. Who has the artifacts? Who has information? Does anybody have this or does anybody have that? So it's kind of interesting that this was trying to be pieced together as early as the 1920s. And then this is J.E. Moore on Philippi Creek, where the county was dredging the Fruitville-Venice drainage district so that the Palmer family could do the celery fields out at the Palmer Farms, which is now the celery fields, you know, out east of the interstate. And J.E. Moore finds mineralized skeleton. So he found a human skeleton that was fossilized, hard as a rock. And nearby, he found mastodon remains. And there's even a suggestion that he found mastodon remains that had been hit with a projectile point, an arrowhead, and the bone had grown around it and healed. So none of that stuff is available to us now, but this is what they were reporting at the time. And this was believed to be maybe a 10,000 to 20,000 year old skeleton at that time because of the mineralization of it. It went on display at museums up north, and then it was lost. And that's very unfortunate because this would have been a critical part of Sarasota history. At any rate, Inglewood is not without its mounds. One of the very first mounds was studied in the 1900s in the area by the Smithsonian was this big mound down in Inglewood. And Mr. Newman came down from the Smithsonian Institute. This was a big deal. There was articles about it in the paper every day, and they began to excavate this Indian mound there in Inglewood. Funny thing is, nobody knows where this was. And I was at a meeting down in Inglewood one day, and I said, you know, nobody knows where this is. And somebody piped in and said, well, no, it's right across from Joe's Barbershop. Well, where was Joe's Barbershop? Then you kind of go down that rabbit trail to find where Joe's Barbershop was, so then you can figure out where the mound was. They actually brought all the artifacts up to Sarasota and displayed them at the Chamber of Commerce. And they put a little legend in there to describe the different things, and that's what these articles are all about. These two people here, Dottie Davis on the left was the county historian working for the county, and then John Fales was an amateur archaeologist. They decided to do a survey of all the known Indian sites in the county. They called it their windshield survey, and that was really the first attempt to document where all the sites were. In that process, they really focused on this site down in Inglewood that was going to be destroyed because the Intracoastal Waterway was going to be dredged. And this had been an approved site for putting all the spoil from the Intracoastal. So they were just going to bulldoze this mound and then stack up Intracoastal Waterway fill material on top of it. But because of the survey and because of the work that was done, they convinced the county commissioners, convinced the federal government not to do that. And this is now Indian Mound Park. And you can see all the contours of the mound. Now, they did archaeological work here thinking that the whole mound was going to be destroyed. So they did quite a few test pits. And this is what the archaeologists do when they're digging these test pits. They're very careful as they go down. Everything's measured, everything's photographed and sketched. And you see the the water level there at the bottom, and then you see black dirt and shells and shells and black dirt and shells and shells, and that shows different habitation periods over time. And then you see another cross section down here of the areas that they cut. So this is 1965. It was called Paulson Point at the time. It's also called the Sarasota County Mound because it was like the first mound that had been excavated with the help of the county. And then now it's Indian Mound Park. This is the Florida Anthropologists. That is the peer-reviewed journal that all archaeological science in Florida kind of passes through. And these are some images there that show the work taking place. They used the road gang prisoners to dig the holes, and then they had volunteers and archaeologists doing the sifting of the discoveries. Ripley and Adelaide Bullen were supervising this. They're the same couple who had worked at historic Spanish Point campus for Gordon Palmer. But I wanted to show you today, these are some of the pottery samples that came from that site in Inglewood. You see all this different decorated pottery. Most of it is small pieces because, of course, it's 2,000-3,000 years old, so it has broken over the years. But you see all this artistic flair in the different dotted and hatched, and some of it looks like it's made to look like a woven basket, which I think is fascinating. And then you see on the left, projectile points made out of chert, made out of agatized coral in some cases. And then on the right-hand side, you see plummets or pendants. These are made of shells. You can see this is the inner column of the lightning whelk or the horse conch, and they cut the little groove there so they can tie a little cord around it, and they smooth it and carve it. This one actually has some extra carving on it. These are little pendants made out of pottery. This one's made out of bone. These are made out of shell, and then these are made out of stone. So a lot of different types of belongings. These are things that belong to people. You know, they've been talking about these things like they're artifacts. They're like for us. You know, these are things that the people live to get through their daily life and to live their culture. This was their life. And here you see, look at these amazing shark's teeth with holes punched through them so they could use them for beads, little vertebra beads, little pieces of shell cut into different shapes, and then pieces of deer bone fashioned into points that were used for sewing and poking holes. And then more beads up here, and then pieces of fossilized bone like you find out on the beaches down there. And this was carved into a tool. So fascinating. And then all sorts of things made out of shells, olive shells made into beads, pecten shells made into beads, arca shells made into beads, little fighting conchs made into net weights and hammers, lightning whelks made into hammers to bust open other shells and to break open oysters, and then also to carve wood. So this one right here that I've got my cursor has a sharpened edge on it, so it can be used to carve wood. They have holes in them, so sticks can be put through the holes so that they can use it like a axe or an adze. And then these drinking vessels or vessels to hold liquid or food made out of a lightning whelk, where they literally cut all the shell away, cut out the inner column, and made this that just cradles right in your hand. So as we wrap up today, I wanted to kind of celebrate some of the archaeologists who've done work in the area. I didn't talk about each one of them in detail today because I wanted to give you an overview of archaeology in the region. But here's the gentleman that came down from the Smithsonian Institute in the 1930s to take care of the Indian Mound in Inglewood. And then in the middle, John Goggin kind of wrote the book on Florida history and was here very early doing research. Ripley and Adelaide Bullen, who are kind of the predominant modern archaeologists in the 1950s and 60s here in Florida, and who did all the work at Spanish Point campus. Marshall T. Newman here came down from Smithsonian also. He's on the far right of that image. Sonny Cockrell, who has worked for the state, he was the state's first underwater archaeologist, did the work at War Mineral Springs. And then Dottie and John Fales, who are not professional archaeologists, but really helped to support the archaeological world here. And then getting into kind of some of the modern archaeologists, because there's a lot of archaeology that takes place. You've got George Luer, who's been involved in Florida archaeology his whole life. Steve Koski, who's just retired as the county's archaeologist and who's been the principal scientist down at Little Salt for a number of years. Bill Berger, who's unfortunately no longer with us, but had a specialty in the Manatee County sites as well as Sarasota, did a lot of good research. And then Joan Deming and Marion Almy, who started one of the country's largest archaeological consulting firms right here in Sarasota called Archaeological Consultants, Inc. And they've done work all over the country, both historic work and archaeological work. And Marion's daughter, Miranda, who now runs the company, who's done a lot of work at Spanish Point. So Marion was one of the primary archaeologists, along with George Luer, doing all the work at Spanish Point back in the 1980s. And then Miranda got involved in studying materials that were already placed in museums. So those are some of the people. And then I wanted to talk about some of the agencies real quick. You've got the federal government that regulates what happens with archaeological sites, largely through the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, otherwise known as NAGPRA, which requires that Native American tribes be involved in all decisions related to the human remains of their loved ones. And then you've got the State Bureau of Historical Resources, the Division of Historical Resources, which is part of the Secretary of State's office. And that's a large department. So within that, they have the Bureau of Archaeological Research that does all the archaeology. Sarasota County, as I mentioned just a moment ago, has an archaeologist, and they review all the developments in the county for archaeological features. And then the Seminole tribe has their own historic preservation office, which actually, as a sovereign nation, they have their own office and they do their own work, both on lands that they manage as well as supporting, frankly, Native tribes all over the country who need their help, and also working with modern archaeologists as well to find the right balance of learning about these ancient people while respecting them at the same time. And then as far as organizations go, the longest one is the Florida Anthropological Society. Again, this is a professional organization. Their publication is where all the findings are peer reviewed. And then there's the Florida Public Archaeology Network, which is kind of to bridge the gap between academia and professional archaeology and the citizens. So it's kind of citizen science. And they go around the state doing programs. They've helped us numerous times at the historic Spanish Point campus to kind of bring the important history to life down there. And then there's a website called Trail of Florida's Indian Heritage, where you can learn about all the sites in Florida that you can visit. And we are a part of that. So if you were to go to that, you'll see Marie Selby Botanical Gardens and the opportunities here. And then Time Sifters Archaeological Society, which was very much involved at historic Spanish Point back when the Window to the Past exhibit was created, where you get to walk inside the shell mound and actually learn about Native American culture and archaeology right there inside of it. So Time Sifters is a local organization here in Sarasota with monthly meetings. You can look them up online. So there's a lot of ways to get involved. And I just wanted to end as we wrap it up, and Caitlin and I'll try to take a couple questions, with this tremendous timeline of Native American culture in Sarasota, tremendous legacy of preserving it. And not that we haven't lost a lot, but we've preserved a lot more than most communities have. And the tremendous legacy that we have as a part of Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, that we're basically responsible for the care and education on one of the most important archaeological sites in Florida. So I think, Caitlin, we'll leave it at that. And I'll take a couple of minutes to take care of a couple of the questions.
Wonderful. John, one of the questions is Little Salt Springs open to the public, and do they have interpretation and tours there?
It is occasionally open to the public. It's certainly available and open to the public for groups to tour. It is not normally open to the public in the same way, say, that War Mineral Springs is, because it is basically an archaeological research facility.
Interesting. Okay. Are there other archaeological sites that are just waiting to be discovered?
Oh my gosh. There's new stuff found all the time. I mean, that Manasota Key offshore site, there have been people looking for underwater sites in Florida for years and years. But if you think about it, half of Florida that existed in 12,000 years ago is now underwater. So I think the opportunity in the future is, as technology improves, and by the way, all the technologies are changing. It used to be you want to study an archaeological site, you dug it up. Now you do ground penetrating radar, and you do LIDAR, and you study it every which way you can without disturbing it. But yeah, there's going to be numerous sites found out in the underwater. There are going to be more sites found in the woodlands. In fact, that whole Manasota Key offshore site caused my brain now, when I look at a wetland out in a preserve area, I see Native American cemetery. Every single wetland has the potential to hold archaeological features, and in the areas adjacent to those wetlands as well. So I think over time, as we kind of get beyond just looking at the macro obvious shell mounds along the coast, there are going to be tremendous discoveries, and it's going to continue to push back the dating of humans in Florida. You know, right now we're at 14,500 years ago. We know people were here, but I think you're going to see that in the next couple of years be pushed back even further. We know through radiocarbon dating that the archaic shell ring at Spanish Point is at least 4,500 years old. But if we were to do additional radiocarbon dating in this modern era with lower sediments, we might push it back to 6,000. So there's more that can be gained from existing sites, and there's more that can be gained from the other sites. And it works best if it's a collaboration between the archaeologist, the landowner, and one of the native tribes all working together to make that happen.
Great. And your friend and mine, Tony Polk, would like to know, will the signs at the burial ground at HSP be replaced? And second question, can you still see the Palmer collection in Gainesville?
The Palmer collection at University of Florida, Gainesville is not largely on display. It is mostly behind the scenes, as the materials that were removed by the Smithsonian Institute years ago, or that John Webb sent to the Smithsonian. We had a volunteer visit the Smithsonian and take photographs and document some of the materials there. There's some work going on at University of Florida right now on the Osprey, the Palmer site collection as it's known there. But I'm not aware that you can go and see any of those materials there. Question about signs on burial mound. We are in a process of working with Seminole Tribe on the appropriate way to recognize that, which is a sacred site to them.
Great. All right, I think that's all the questions that we have. Oh, sorry, Tony has one more. He wants to know if we can get photos of the Osprey collection.
Sure, we can. In fact, we have a volunteer working right now on putting together some new materials to share with volunteers. And I think that'll be really helpful as they get questions from our guests. So yeah, and Caitlin, thanks so much for co-hosting with me today. And thanks again to Amanda behind the scenes who sets up the Zoom, make sure everybody gets in and gets invited. And thanks again to Jennifer Romanecki for inviting me to present this program today as part of our summer series. And we'll be cooking up some new programs for the fall. And so look forward to seeing you all again back here on the Zoom to learn more about our fascinating regional history and how it intersects with the wonderful botanical garden that Marie Selby Botanical Gardens is. So thanks to everyone for joining us today.